I am starting on page 29, where it starts with "But where?" he asked. All right, so follow along in your book and listen to me doing the reading. But where, he asked, were the cannon he'd been promised? Ron Hunt had refused them, John Smith replied. Powhatan laughed. He understood very well the trick that John had played on him. The next time John should find lighter cannon, he said. Then he asked about the Englishmen outside. Why were they there? Let them be brought in, John had told his bodyguard, to come in two at a time so that the longhouse would never be left unprotected. Powhatan watched the guns file in with the soldiers holding on to them. 2 by 2 the guns came. So many of them. The men should put their guns on the ground, Powhatan said, to show respect. Only enemies asked them to do this, Smith replied, not friends. There is no mention of Pocahontas in John Smith's account of this visit, but surely she was there, smiling to see how John and her father played a kind of game with each other. Her father would make a demand, and John would counter. Usually John won, but Powhatan did not get angry, for both understood the rules of the game. When Captain Newport arrived, Powhatan began the same game. He asked Newport why his men were armed. Weren't they all friends? Of course they were friends, Newport replied, and he ordered the entire bodyguard to retreat to the river. He didn't understand the game at all. When trading began, Captain Newport let Powhatan win every time. For a small amount of corn, he gave away 12 big copper kettles. Indeed, all Powhatan had to do was point to a hatchet, and the hatchet was his. Standing on the sidelines, John Smith was growing huffier and huffier. How would he ever expect fair trade again? John was the only one who would have to see that the settlement was fed, not Newport. And look what he was doing. In desperation, John brought out some blue beads, a kind that the natives had not seen. When Powhatan showed interest, Smith paid little attention. These beads? He didn't have many of these beads, he said, and he really didn't care to part with them. These were a special blue, having taken their color from the sky. Only very important kings could afford to wear them. The more John Smith talked about the beads, the more Powhatan wanted them. In the end, John was able to wangle over 200 bushels of corn for a few pounds of the cheap glass beads. He made up for Newport's bungling, but he didn't get rid of Newport. Newport still had to find gold. This time, John Martin, who didn't like being called a cheat, was sure that he'd found the real thing. Indeed, he got the men in the settlement so excited that they would do nothing but dig for gold. There was no talk, no hope, no work, one settler reported. But dig gold, refine gold, load gold. John Smith didn't even believe it was gold, but Captain Newport wouldn't sail until he had filled his ship with what John called Martin's gilded dirt. On April 10th, 1608, Captain Newport finally decided he had enough, and he left for England. Along with him went Master Wingfield, Captain Archer, and Namontack, a servant boy of Powhatan's, who was learning English, and was to report on what he saw. Newport also took 2 tortoises and 2 ears of corn, for King James loved to get curiosities from the New World. Already he had 2 crocodiles and a wild boar which Newport had brought from a trip to the West Indies. Just before Newport sailed, Powhatan sent him a gift of 20 wild turkeys and asked for 20 swords in return. Without hesitation, Newport handed over the swords and took the turkeys. After Newport sailed, Powhatan sent 20 turkeys to John Smith, and in the same way asked for 20 swords. John replied with a thundering no. Beads and bells, yes. A copper kettle, maybe, but swords, never. The Indians, however, were used to getting what they wanted now. If they couldn't do it one way, they'd do it another. They'd steal swords, if possible, hatchets, if they were handy. They even tried to grab weapons out of the hands of settlers, but when they attempted to surround John Smith in a cornfield, they went too far. Not only did Smith succeed in getting back safely to Jamestown, he managed to take 7 Indian captives with him. Think about how they're going to react now. So the Indians did not get what they wanted. And they were angry. They were kind of used to getting what they wanted. And now John Smith is kind of in charge, and he's kind of playing hardball with them, hard to get. And since they're not getting what they want right away, they resorted to stealing it. So now they're not being friendly anymore. And John Smith was in a cornfield, and they kind of jumped him and tried to take all his weapons. So he got back safely and took 7 Indian hostages with him. So let's keep reading to find out what happens next. Powhatan tried to get the captives released, first one way, then another. Finally, he sent Pocahontas to Jamestown, along with Rawhunt, some relatives of the captured Indians, and the gift of a deer. But Pocahontas was not to beg. Powhatan warned her. She was the daughter of a king. She should simply present John Smith with a deer and assure him of Powhatan's love. Let Rawhunt and the relatives do the begging. So Pocahontas put aside her coaxing, frolicsome ways. She stood straight and proud as a princess, and in the end, John Smith and the ruling council agreed that for her sake they would let the prisoners go. But first, the prisoners must attend a church service. They had been required to do this every day they'd been in Jamestown, and it is possible that Pocahontas, Rawhunt, and the visiting relatives went too. So remember, one of the requirements of the settlers from England was to get the Native Americans to convert to Christianity. So requiring them to go to church every single day is a pretty big start. Let's find out what happens. This time, those Englishmen who owned armor wore it to church as if they wished to impress the natives that their god was the god of war power. Perhaps the natives were awed, as the English intended them to be, at the sight of metal-suited men clanking up and down on their knees. Yet, if Pocahontas was there, she must have wondered at this strange English god who wanted no joy, no dancing, and no shouting. Their priest did not even raise a sweat with his talking. Indeed, half the time he talked with his eyes closed. Surely, if Pocahontas was there, she was glad to get out into the sunshine again. She may have turned a cartwheel before seeking out John Smith, who, as usual, was ready to make her happy with presents. So think about the way that they worship their god, Oki. They dance around fires, and they have all their services outside, and they're very, very interactive, meaning they do a lot of fun things and sing and kind of enjoy being out in the nature and thankful for all of that. Then the Englishmen, the settlers that came into Jamestown, they kind of believe in their god a different way, and they worship him a different way with a very sappy or soft service. So they were saying that the priest didn't even dance and didn't shout and didn't get excited. He talked with his eyes closed. So I think they were kind of bored. So let's find out what happens next. With the return of the captives, Powhatan's people kept more to themselves. As a favorite princess, Pocahontas would probably not have had to help with the planting or do as much work as the other girls her age did, but she would have helped care for the younger children. She may have woven baskets or sewn skins together for her skirts, decorated them with beads, gathered flowers for her hair. Pocahontas would not have visited John Smith's world this summer, for John was not there. Yet to know her story, one must follow John too. And he was off exploring with a party of 14 men. He didn't find either the Pacific Ocean or a gold mine, but he did travel 3,000 miles throughout Chesapeake Bay, up the Potomac River, nosing into inlets, following one crooked creek after another. He added new names on his map and drew new rivers and streams. He dug up some ore that might be silver. He saw animals, otters, beavers, martens, minks, whose fur would certainly bring money in England. And fish. He'd never seen so many fish. They were packed so thick in one place that the barge had to push through them. They looked like good eating fish, too, but the men had no nets with them. John Smith grabbed a frying pan and tried to scoop some up in it, but as one explorer said, "We found it a bad instrument to catch fish with." Then John began spearing fish with his sword. This worked better. And that's where we're going to stop for today. Halfway down page 33. Okay, I want you to go back and fill out your next section in your reading log. If you have any questions or unsure of any words, please write them down on the side and we'll talk about them tomorrow.